Opportunity today to talk about our work on nutrition and NPN. Thanks everyone for staying to the end, and hopefully I don't make people hungry, probably not. And I think that I'm really happy that earlier today we had a beautiful presentation by Dr. Gowan, and I really do wholeheartedly believe that integrative medicine and focusing on lifestyle choices is a really underappreciated and very powerful approach to managing one's MPN and realistically any chronic disorder, to tell you the truth. Okay, so, oops, sorry. Oh, here we go. Okay, so we've heard today a lot about inflammation in myeloproliferative neoplasms. From my standpoint, my perspective, although MPNs are at the present time technically classified as a cancer, they really do have a lot of similarities between other chronic inflammatory disorders. So maybe one can think of MPNs at the intersection between a chronic blood cancer and a chronic inflammatory disorder. We say, what is inflammation? We talk about inflammation. Something's red, something's hot, burning, not really feeling very well. And those characteristics do sum up a lot of the symptoms that MPN patients feel. So inflammation is driven by inflammatory proteins that are also termed cytokines, and on the left in the Venn diagram are inflammatory cytokines that have been demonstrated to be elevated in different types of blood cancers, MPN in the light blue, MDS, which is a similar disease, and then AML and CML, which are other myeloid disorders. And although each of the different type of myeloid cancers may have a slightly unique number of cytokines that are elevated, they all do have in common elevations of key inflammatory cytokines, such as TNF-alpha. And when certain cytokines, in particular TNF-alpha, is elevated, this can drive some symptoms in MPN, such as fatigue. And with this picture, wanted to try to make the idea of inflammation as a driver of clonal expansion in MPN a little bit more able to grasp. We're learning not only in MPN, but in other myeloid malignancies, as well as this thing that we heard about earlier to this clonal hematopoiesis of indeterminate potential, where people as they age have mutant cells in their blood. A key feature of these mutant cells is that they're resistant to inflammation. And we know that under chronic inflammatory stress, which in the bone marrow, so the grass is supposed to be the bone marrow and the little eggs are supposed to be blood stem cells, that when the chronic inflammation is present, the owl is there trying to go around. It can pick off the pink or the normal cells because it can see them. But say, for example, you had a variant cell in there that was a little bit different and was able to blend into the green background, then the inflammation owl couldn't see it. So over time, when the owl is roaming around, the owl is going to be picking off all of the pink cells that it can see, and then the green cells, which are camouflaged, will grow. And so that's one way of thinking about potentially how, as we age, these mutant cells, which are resistant to inflammation, grow over time. And we found previously that the JAK2 V617F cells are resistant to inflammation. And on the left, or on my right, what's really interesting about these cells, including JAK2, as well as other mutant cells such as TET2 or DNMT3A, the cells themselves further promote inflammation. So it's sort of like a vicious cycle that you potentially do need inflammation to begin with in order for that cell to grow up. But at the end of the day, when the cells are expanded themselves, then they create inflammation themselves and further fuel their own expansion. So thinking about ways to reduce inflammation through an approach that would be low risk, have few or no side effects, and have low cost to patients, as well as empower patients to play a key role in their own treatment, we turn to diet as an approach to that would fit the bill here. So when we're talking about diet to manage NPN, a lot of times people think that there's a specific food that they can just eat whatever they want. They can eat junk food, and then they just add on this mushroom, and it's going to be good. This is really not what we're talking about. What we're talking about more is a more holistic approach in terms of what you eat, not you eat horribly and then you just add something on like you popping a pill, but it really is a more it's important what you don't eat and what you do eat, and utilizing nutrition and healthy lifestyle as a way to reduce inflammation and improve outcomes. And this is what this slide is saying, that there's a lot of fad diets out there that in some cases can seem quite extreme, but really for long-term health benefits and the ability to maintain a healthy diet or healthy eating pattern long-term, really one should focus on a more holistic approach and not extreme dieting, because those things tend to, you can follow it for a little while, then you yo-yo, and really don't necessarily lead to long-term changes in one's way of eating. So we turn to the Mediterranean diet, which is in general regarded as a very healthful diet and has been around in our cultures for a long time, and looking at groups of people who naturally adhere to a Mediterranean diet lifestyle. A paper looked at people in Greece, and they followed how these people were eating and designated them whether they were very adherent to a Mediterranean diet or less adherent to a Mediterranean diet with a score, and found that the people who were free living and on their own were following more of a Mediterranean diet survived longer and had better outcomes. And then this large study, which Dr. Gowan mentioned briefly earlier today, called the PREDIMED diet, which was a very large diet that looked, so they gave people a Mediterranean diet supplemented with olive oil or nuts, and wanted to see whether the patients, that led to improved outcomes with regard to cardiovascular disease, as well as inflammatory cytokines. And you can see that the green and the yellow lines, which are the Mediterranean diet group that they gave nuts, and then the green, the Mediterranean diet group that they gave then extra virgin olive oil, had fewer deaths from cardiovascular causes than the patients on the control diet. I don't have a slide for this, but also they were able to find reductions in inflammatory biomarkers such as high sensitivity CRP, as well as other inflammatory cytokines. So what is a Mediterranean diet? I guess what we can say, we would not necessarily characterize it as a, quote, diet, but more of an eating pattern and a lifestyle. So there are no real specific rules or restrictions, but simply a focus on whole plant foods and healthy fats. And also important because one may think, well, my culture doesn't come from the Mediterranean, maybe it's not the way that I eat, but really can have a Mediterranean-inspired eating pattern utilizing foods from many cultures, so can really be adaptable. And the Mediterranean diet pyramid really has less red meats, sweets, and processed foods. And then in moderation, in terms of your proteins, would select fish and poultry and dairy, not necessarily low fat, but the Mediterranean doesn't necessarily emphasize low fat, but emphasizes good fats. And then eating lots of vegetables, greens, fruits, whole grains, beans, and nuts. And also to emphasize this is not only a diet, but a lifestyle. So incorporation of physical activity, eating meals with each other, so utilizing meals as a way to engage with other people and enjoy the meals together as sort of a way to bond with your family and friends. And Mediterranean eating guidelines, so lots of vegetables, lots of beans, fruits and nuts, whole grains, and cereals, as well as seafoods. And then, as I mentioned, healthy fats and proteins, focusing on this extra virgin olive oil, as well as other good fats, avocados, nuts, seeds, and seafoods, and then high in lean meats, but some fishes, in particular things like salmon, that have good fats in them. So not necessarily focusing on reducing fats, but focusing on the quality of the fats that you're eating. So given the discrete data for utilizing a Mediterranean diet to improve outcomes in other chronic disorders, such as atherosclerosis, we wanted to ask whether diet can impact myeloproliferative neoplasms. And so we've performed 2 interventional studies thus far, and I want to emphasize that because diet is really in its infancy in terms of treatment for MPN, I want to emphasize that the primary objectives in our first 2 studies were feasibility. So basically asking, can MPN patients actually follow a Mediterranean diet? In our first study, we compared a Mediterranean versus a standard USDA diet, which would be, the things that you see on the MyPlate, which we sort of regarded as a, quote, sham diet, so really not a real diet, something that standard US people would be following anyway. We took 28 participants, randomized them to either of the 2 diets, and in this study, they had in-person dietitian counseling. They were sent weekly curriculum via email in a colorful PDF format. And for this, because it was an in-person study, we collected CBCs, chemistries, high-sensitivity CRP, plasma cytokines, as well as gut microbiome. And in the second subsequent study, we called it the E-intervention, which was performed fully online. In this study, we randomized people to either a Mediterranean or a DASH diet, which is primarily used for hypertension. We also did 28 participants, and with this, we had Zoom dietitian counseling and written curriculum, and all of our surveys were done online. So for the E-intervention, our primary objective was to see, can MPN patients participate in fully online diet interventions without ever actually seeing a person face-to-face, but on Zoom, but never actually in person. So here's the initial pilot study. This is the in-person one. As I mentioned, people were randomized to either Mediterranean diet or just the standard USDA guidelines for Americans. We wanted to see what people were doing just on their own, pretending we were wanted to get a glimpse of what they were eating on their own and how they were feeling. So for 2 weeks, we simply watched them, asked what they were eating, took blood and stool samples. And then at week 3 to 12 was what we call the active intervention, where people were randomized to one of the 2 groups. They got in-person dietitian counseling sessions. We wanted to mirror it after the Predimed diet, so the people in the Mediterranean diet group got 2 installments of olive oil, and then the people in the USDA guidelines for Americans got grocery gift cards, so that both groups were equal, but we wanted to emphasize Mediterranean foods for the Mediterranean, or olive oil for the Mediterranean group. Also, patients performed symptom surveys, the MPN-SAF, with a little fewer extra questions, as well as what we call 24-hour diet recalls, as well as asking them feasibilities, how easy the diet was to adhere to. Also took two blood samples and 2 stool samples during the active intervention period. And then what we wanted to do was a follow-up period, which was week 13 to 15. Basically, the people were no longer receiving our active intervention of dietitian counseling or the curriculum, and we wanted to ask whether are they going to continue to follow the diet once they're stopped. We're not watching them anymore. And so then at week 15, we asked another set of surveys, got blood and stool. And so to emphasize, the main point of the study was basically to ask, can MPN patients change their diet with dietitian counseling in a written curriculum? And so the way we measured the Mediterranean diet is this 16-point questionnaire called the Mediterranean Diet Adherence Score, or MEDAS, and we chose a score of 8 or above as what we would say highly adherent to a Mediterranean diet. So we wanted to have at least 80% of the patients in the Mediterranean diet arm achieving this MEDAS score of at least 8, and that's in the pink, and the orange is the active intervention period. And you can see that throughout the entire 10-week active intervention, the Mediterranean diet group was able, more than 80% of the Mediterranean diet group was able to achieve a highly adherent Mediterranean diet eating score. And in contrast, at no time point in the USDA group did 80% of them achieve a highly adherent Mediterranean diet score. So we concluded that if we give MPN patients dietitian counseling on a Mediterranean diet and written curriculum, they can follow a Mediterranean diet. And although the study was not what's called powered to detect a statistically significant difference in symptoms or reduction in symptoms, we wanted to observe how people were feeling. And these are what's called waterfall plots, with each bar being a person. And we have this is the change in their symptom score compared to baseline at week 6, 9, 12, and 15. And interestingly, in both groups, we did observe that a good fraction of patients did reduce their symptom burden. It appeared to be more striking in the Mediterranean diet group. But this is not necessarily unexpected, that really any type of dietitian counseling would lead to an improvement in the quality of one's diet and potentially improve symptoms. And other things that we measured in the study that I won't necessarily go into, blood counts. Short story, we really didn't see any changes in blood counts, not unexpected. Cholesterol, did not see any significant difference in cholesterol, but it was a short-term study and a small number of patients, so we were not expecting to be able to detect a difference. Also, with the high sensitivity CRP, we did note some reductions in some patients, but again, not statistically powered to detect a difference. Inflammatory proteins in the blood, which I'll show in the next slide, and gut microbiome as well. And so these are different plasma cytokines, with each black line being a patient, and these are different inflammatory cytokines. And as you can see, it's very heterogeneous. Some people had a reduction, but the study was not powered to detect any statistical differences. So I'm simply showing this to demonstrate how different MPN patients are, and patients respond differently over time. And then moving on to the second diet intervention, which we performed during COVID, which was great to do an intervention that didn't require patients to come in person, so it could be done all online, where again we observed patients for 2 weeks, and then they were randomized to either a Mediterranean or a DASH diet. And so dietitian counseling was performed via Zoom as opposed to in person. We also did the Mediterranean diet adherence score, and then these 24-hour diet recalls. And then as an alternative non-invasive way to measure inflammatory cytokines, we sent them an oral mucosal transudate kit where you basically it's a little pad that you put in trying to capture I don't say the saliva, but it's a transudate that comes right between your tooth and your gum. So they put it in their between their tooth and their gum, and it sucks up the liquid. And then the primary objective for this was feasibility. Symptom survey completion for this one, patients did an MPN-SAF symptom score for every single day throughout the study. They did an ASA-24, which actually is a quite laborious online 24-hour diet recall, the 16-point meta score, and then we wanted to see whether patients actually showed up to their dietitian visits, because if you've never even met the person, there's really going to be maybe less of an incentive for them to actually show up to their Zoom visits. So interestingly, patients really, without any prompting, were able to complete, in particular in the Mediterranean diet group, almost had 100% compliance with the daily symptom scores. So MPN patients are really great at filling out a daily symptom score without us even asking. The DASH group was a little bit lower. It may be reading into this too much, but one could potentially think that if a person was more engaged and happier with their diet, they might be more inclined to fill out the daily symptom scores. Again, here's the symptom burden, just looking at week 8 and week 16, and in both groups, proportion of the patients enjoyed a 50% reduction in their symptom burden. And then completion of the diet surveys and dietitian visits. On the left, we had almost 100% show rate for the dietitian visits, which I guess is not unexpected given that they were getting a free registered dietitian visit, so would be in their own best interest to take part in that. On the left, the MEDOS, which probably takes about a minute to complete. We had relatively good compliance with the ASA-24, which probably takes about 20 to 30 minutes to complete, and I have to admit is quite laborious, and I couldn't do it on my own. It was, we need to work on that for patients doing it by themselves online. Our remedy to this is to do it over the phone and just asking the patients what they ate for the past 24 hours for our next studies. So the next steps, we have established that MPN patients are eager to participate in dietary studies. We also know that if we give MPN patients dietitian counseling, they can change their diet. And a Mediterranean diet seems like a reasonable diet to move forward with, given the strong evidence that it is an anti-inflammatory diet. So we're moving on to do a much larger study that is powered to detect improvement in symptom burden, and building a online curriculum, sort of like a class, which would have passive lectures to watch, written curriculum, group classes, as well as then one-on-one online dietitian counseling, because that seemed to work for most of the patients in our second e-intervention study. So with that, like to stop. Want to acknowledge for the first study was mainly run by a MD PhD student, Laura Mendez, who's now back in her home country of Mexico and is working to develop a PhD program in her own university in Baja California. Second, for the e-intervention study, was run by Jerry Lee, who is a registered dietitian, but is now an epidemiology student at UC Irvine, and his mentor is Andy Odegaard. The original thoughts for a dietary study came out that through discussions with Ruben Mesa as well as Robin Scherber, and help with other Mayo colleagues. So thank you very much.